Coherence Podcast invites you to get up close and personal with creatives who have figured out how to make a living doing the thing that they love most, and to build custom careers that truly fit their sensibilities. I'm here to guide you through the wild world of working for yourself so you can cut out the noise, center your own judgment, and live a life that makes amazing sense for you. My guest today is Alice Turpin-Johnson, who is a relationship coach and specifically helps people during that uncomfortable, tense moment of decision of whether or not they should stay in a relationship or leave. And I can think of no one better to help shepherd someone through such a tough conundrum, an open question as Alice. She's someone who I just admire for her depth of feeling. She's someone who's so embodied and intuitive. And I think that is a good segue into why I thought of interviewing her for the podcast, because she knew when she started her coaching business that she wanted to create a structure for her business that would afford her the life that she wanted to live as a whole. And for Alice, wilderness and a wildlife and adventure and nature are just so integral to her sense of well-being that she knew that she needed to design enough time to allow her to go get in the water, to surf in the morning, to go on mountain biking trips with her partner, to just go out and be camping for long stretches of time. And one way she's figured out how to do that is to condense her coaching calls within 3 days and really do a little light admin on one of the other days. But she's set up a life that feels minimal, not only in the footprint of the physical space that she lives in with her partner, but also just the amount of time that she allows work to take up. And she's an interesting case because she loves her work. It would be easy to presumably just kind of let it spill over and bleed into other things that she loves. But she knew from the get-go that it wasn't going to work unless she found that right balance for herself. So for anyone who feels similarly, like you know that you need a certain amount of time, whether that's to adventure or whether that's to rest, whatever it might be for you, it might be being with your family, whatever that is, having the audacity to build that into your business structure from the get-go, telling clients, hey, I can truly only work during these hours is radical. And Alice is here to tell you about it today. So hope you stick with us and listen in. Well, Alice, I am so excited to talk today because you and I, over the pandemic, really sustained monthly calls. And I think of you as like a unique relationship in my life in that we've only met in person a couple times, but it almost felt like we had this like long distance phone call pen pal relationship. And now we get to kind of have a different kind of conversation together and share it with others. So I'm super excited to dive in, and thanks for being here. How do you talk about what you do with other people when they ask?
Yeah. So I generally tell people that I support folks who are trying to decide whether to keep trying in their relationship or to let go. I generally am working alongside people who have been in the midst of wrestling with that choice point for some time, for some months, sometimes for some years, and who are in that place of, do I stay or do I leave? And just feel mired in the decision and in fears around making the wrong decision, in questions about how to even go about making that decision. So that's generally who I'm supporting, who I'm working alongside of.
Yeah, I feel like it just personally, I hear that and it brings up a potent emotion of like relatability and being like, oh my gosh, I have been in that situation many times in my life, and it's so fraught, and there's so much like internal um, chaos at times that I hear that and I just want to like dive into conversation with you. I am curious, like what range of experiences or more like reactions you get when you tell people, kind of assuming that there's quite a range.
Yeah. So the way that I talk about what I do kind of varies from situation to situation. As shorthand, I just tell people that I'm a relationship coach. Um, and I think that gets more varied reactions than when I give a little bit more of an in-depth description of what I do and who I work with. I think the range is kind of from curiosity and lots of questions around what that sort of work entails to kind of uncomfortable silence, um,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is is a reflection of the range of the sorts of permission we have as a society to explore different aspects of relationships, certainly, but really of life. That I think there are places that collectively feel uncomfortable to go. Um, and I think that is sometimes where the uncomfortable silence comes from.
Mm-hmm. It does not surprise me. I mean, to put words to what kind of feels obvious, but I still want to hear how you talk about it, is like, what is so uncomfortable about thinking about that choice point?
I think, I mean, the first thing that came up when you asked that was that I want to think about that question and talk about that question for the next several months, rather than just the next several minutes. But I will do a bottom line exploration of it. Um, I think one of the things that makes it so uncomfortable is the relationship that we have with grief. I think often grief is reserved for what we kind of dog ear as the big, significant moments in life when a loved one passes away. Um, or when we or somebody close to us experiences tremendous loss because of some type of disaster, that we say that's what grief is for. And because we relegate grief to just being for these big, weighty moments, I think our relationship with grief can be fraught and can also be unfamiliar. And I think that the the question itself, the choice point itself, so often grief is built into the process of answering that question.
Mm.
And
Yes.
I think there is just that element of recognizing that making a decision like this likely involves grief.
Yes. I think that is well put, well bottom lined, and it's interesting almost imagining like someone embarking on becoming a relationship coach, and I wonder how present or conscious the fact is that you're actually going to be interacting with grief a lot more. And I think you did a great job of spelling out, like, yeah, it's not just even the finality of, we break up and the loss of that relationship, but there's so many other things to grieve that are a little bit more nuanced, of just the change. It strikes me that, like, I remember in the coach training someone saying people come to coaching because they want change. And I think sometimes I, in my like sort of optimism mindset, look to change as like, well, change is positive. Change is, I always want to think about it in terms of evolving and becoming, more of yourself or better in some way. And I think, and sometimes I'm just reflecting here that I can maybe discount or not even face the fact that to change, it is, there is a grief, there's a letting go with every evolution, and it's not always easy.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think it's both. I think it's, what you described as well, this energizing process of evolution, of unfolding, of discovering parts of ourselves we hadn't met before, of all of these pieces. And I think it's all of it rather than it even kind of necessarily bouncing back from one to the other. I think it's much more watercolor than acrylic, and that there's a lot of blending. And I think that, yeah, I think it's all of it.
With grief and the idea of letting go, in my mind, it made me think about what broad strokes to tie back to the watercolor here, the broad strokes that I know about your life, and what I've heard is that your place with your partner is like, it's very modest sized, and I think you came to mind as someone to that would be a great guest for this podcast for many reasons, but even just looking kind of materialistically at your lifestyle. And I know at the beginning of this year, when I was asking you what was exciting, you talked about like this desire to really try to not buy anything new and fix things up. And I know you to be such a nature lover, and I almost kind of feel like your like physical dwelling is small, but your connection with the outside world is large. It's definitely like you're out, you and your partner are out, surfing or mountain biking and hiking and camping. And I guess it's like you had to, and I don't know how attached you were at some point, to like let go of some of these material things in order to live the values aligned life that you're living now. And I mean, gosh, there's so many angles here, but one is like, do you recognize that that is kind of unique, the way that you've set up your home life and the amount of time you spend outdoors?
um, I think I do, and in some ways, I think I don't. But you asked about letting go of material things in order to allow for this. And for me, my connection with nature and my need for deep, expansive relationship with nature has existed for as long as I can remember. I remember my earliest memories in childhood are memories of time spent in nature and time spent with nature. And that never went away for me. I think as I've grown older, I've perhaps developed more of a language to talk about it, but the energy of it has been consistent for all of my life that I can remember. And so for me, it really has been one of the most significant things that I've built my life around. When I was deciding whether or not to go to college and where to go to college, my criteria had to do with proximity to wild nature more than anything else. And so for me, it really has been more of a process of honoring that priority, honoring those relationships, rather than a process of letting go.
I'm almost hearing that it hasn't felt like a letting go, because you're really almost feeling like what you're seeking, like what you're bringing in, is more of the focus versus sort of what you're moving away from.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
I was just gonna kind of paint a picture of your childhood. Like, could you share where you were born, and like, did your parents facilitate that in you? I'm always curious because I can blame my parents for different things, but they didn't really bring us out in the wilderness at
Yeah.
all, and we did hardly ever went to the beach growing up in San Diego. And so, like, as I have a kid of my own, I think about like, oh, what are some things that I would ideally like to have a deeper relationship with? I think nature is one of them, and I just get so curious about how that shows up for people who feel that so strongly as you do.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's interesting because I have a different, well, let me back up. So as a kid, I always wanted to play outside, and my parents really facilitated creating as many opportunities as they could for me to play outside. I grew up in Santa Cruz, and we went to the beach all the time. We went to the redwood forests on the UCSC campus all the time. Every summer, my mom would take us camping, and my dad would always make sure that I was set up to build mud pies in the backyard, and he and I gardened together. And so my parents really facilitated me spending a ton of time outside and also in bigger nature at the beach, in the forest, all throughout my childhood.
I like that term, bigger nature, because I think there's a distinction there of like, it's one thing
Hmm.
to just go outside in your kind of manicured grass backyard that has a fence around it. And it's
Hmm.
another thing to kind of be in the expanse of a forest.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting that distinction, kind of that feeling of being in nature that nobody put there, that
Mm-hmm.
wasn't, that humans didn't kind of decide, okay, there will be we're going to allow a little tidy, well controlled patch of something alive right here,
Mm-hmm.
but rather to be in an environment where the whole environment is wild, is wilderness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a word that I would associate with you, like wild, just like alive and vibrant, but also like this untamed, and like we've spoken in the past about um, kind of your rebellious streak of sorts, and just
Mm.
like, yeah. Do you, does that resonate? Do you feel a little wild?
It does. Yeah. So we were chatting just briefly about values before we started recording, and I have a list of my core values. I have them set up on a page, like a little wheel with different sections for each value, and there are about
On your website?
a few of them are listed on my
Mm-hmm.
website, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
as well. And I went through a process of trying to figure out, okay, if there was just one value that encapsulated all of these. Um, Different people have really different perspectives on values and how to do values work and what makes for effective values work. And one perspective that I heard was, if you have more than one or two core values, the water is too muddy for you to be able to really use them as a guide, which is not a perspective that I wholeheartedly agree with.
Mm-hmm.
I actually see a lot of benefit in intimately knowing many of our core values. And also I was like, okay, if I were to do that, is there one word, is there one value that holds all of these? And these are kind of sub values of that one value. And the word that I eventually landed on that really resonated is wilderness. Yeah. And it's, for me, it's about the wilderness of nature. It's about connection with the feral wild of the forests and the mountains and the sky and the birds and the moss and all of these wild others. And it's also about the wilderness that exists in relationships, that two people or a community of people come together, and we create this wilderness, this space between us, among us. And I think that when we show up to that process really honestly and really willing to be brave, that it is a wilderness. And it's also about the wilderness inside of ourselves. Like the things inside of myself that maybe even a part of me is afraid to whisper out loud, lest I admit that it's true, and being willing to look in those places and to live in those places and to acknowledge those places without trying to control them or kind of subdue them, but instead just allowing them and experiencing them and noticing them.
Mm. Yeah, I can see why this word is so fitting. It's a really interesting, challenging exercise of distilling, but it's interesting starting with the word wild. And we don't say it wilderness, but it's hidden in plain sight right there in the wilderness. I'm not surprised that we're kind of our inroad to this conversation has been around really strong values of yours. When I work with clients and we do a values exercise, I try to make it explicit about why this is worth doing and how you can even implement values and access them as a tool. In the same vein, could you share with people listening how this core unifying value of wilderness gets expressed? Like, how does that actually look or get translated into action for you? And maybe even in the three domains that you shared around, attention, like your relationship with nature itself, how it shows up in thinking or tending to relationship, and then also relationship to self.
Absolutely. So when it comes to my relationship with nature itself, part of it is making sure that I'm tending to that relationship in the ways that I tend to any of my relationships, making sure that I'm prioritizing time in the places that I am in relationship, making sure that I'm spending time going out to the ocean to surf or just to sit and be with the sea, making sure that I'm creating time to go to the places that I love to climb and spend time with the rocks and exist, to share time together, and understanding what a priority that is, not allowing other things to encroach on that, but really protecting those relationships and honoring them as the relationships that they are. And it's also about an ongoing kind of growing, unfolding effort and exploration around what's the impact I'm having on these others who I love. What's the impact I'm having on the sea? What's the impact that I'm having on the air? What's the impact that I'm having on animals? And and considering that question from that relational standpoint of, what does it look like to act in love toward these others that I love, and allowing that to inform my behavior and to encourage me to grow in different ways and change things when I need to change things. Um and then thinking about it in terms of, I'll go interior next, inside the wilderness within myself. It's being willing to tell myself what's true for me from moment to moment. It's learning how to sit with or move with or cry with or laugh with whatever emotion I'm actually experiencing, rather than the emotions I think I should be experiencing in a certain moment, or the degree of emotionality that I think makes sense for a specific instance, but allowing myself to actually feel what I feel and allowing myself to actually acknowledge what I need, what I want, even before I have a plan, for what that means, before I have any ideas about how I can make sure that that need or want is going to feel safe or controllable or whatever it is, just starting with being with the wilderness of it, of the truth of the thing. And then bringing that into the context of my relationship with others, my relationship with other people, of within whatever boundaries I need from one relationship to the next, bringing the truth of myself to the relationship, and also recognizing the wilderness in the other person, the ways that the other person is whole and is their own wilderness, and not trying to tame it or bend it to my will or get it to be what I need or want it to be, but instead approaching it like I might approach a trail in the woods, like curious, barefoot, walking gently, understanding that things are living there already and have been living there and growing there for years, for long before I met this person, and approaching it with that kind of curiosity and that kind of love.
Yeah, it's as I hear you give voice to the inner wilderness, it's just remarkable how challenging it is for so many people to do the first part and the second part. I'm glad that you brought up both. One is just that kind of tuning in and seeing, being curious about what's truly inside of oneself, and then being able to accept what's there before jumping to conclusions, and then to recognize that in others. And my hunch is that maybe one part of that comes a little easier to people than the other, or vice versa. But I think they're challenging, both of them.
Mm-hmm.
And again, not surprised then that what you've been able to do is create a life and a business that supports the lifestyle that you want, because you are constantly tuning in and not being afraid just to look and see, and to validate, and to say, okay, well, this thing that I just saw in the wilderness of myself, like it's there. So what do I do with that? I guess to kind of bring it a little bit to your coaching business, and how it does facilitate your a lifestyle that lets you have space for the time, for the wilderness. What does that look like in practice for you right now?
Yeah. Okay, well, first I'll say you said something about me tuning in and not being afraid. I will agree with the tuning in part. The not being afraid part is definitely a case by case situation.
That's a good distinction.
And I think that's part of it, right? That part of it is a willingness to be really scared sometimes. Because there are, of course, things that I am afraid to look at, or am afraid to admit to myself, or to acknowledge, and sometimes it's like a wild wrestling, and sometimes I'll sit there and be like, yeah, there's a thing that I know that I'm feeling, and for a moment I'm not going to look at it. I'm going to go do something else instead. I'm going to pretend that's not happening. So yes to the practice of tuning in, and sometimes to the not being afraid. So currently the service that I offer is one-on-one coaching. So working one-on-one with individuals. And I work with individuals who are facing this choice point rather than working with a couple. So working with one person who's in the process of approaching this decision. And the way I logistically structure my work is that I schedule calls with my clients 3 days a week. Right now, Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday are the days that I schedule client calls. And often I don't schedule any calls of any kind or any time-bound appointments on the rest of the days of the week, on the remaining 4 days of the week. So on those days, the flow of my actual work really depends on my energy. my energy kind of throughout the month, throughout my cycle each month, my energy for different tasks is very different and for different types of work. There are times when my energy for writing is abundant, and there are other times when I'll have kind of a spring cleaning energy to get done a bunch of tasks that I avoid the rest of the month. So I sort of let my energy dictate what I'm doing from week to week in that regard. And then oftentimes the rest of my work, I'm building around the ways that I'm playing outside. So I might decide that I want to wake up and surf at sunrise with my partner or with a couple of friends. And if that's the case, then I'll wake up at 5:30 and head out to the ocean and surf for a handful of hours. And that might lead me to a coffee shop to do some writing, or it might lead me back home for some breakfast and then kind of whatever comes next. And so I typically will arrange my workday, and I don't even really think about them as work days and non-work days. They're all just days. They're all just days of doing this thing, of of living. But I tend to prioritize spending time in nature and spending time with the people in my life.
I'm imagining that some people listening to you share about your schedule are like feeling pangs of admiration and envy, even of like, oh my goodness, like how can you have structured calls 3 days a week and then get to go play outside? Like, I want to do that. What would you say to them?
So I structured my schedule like this from the beginning. It wasn't always the same days, but I decided when I started my practice that this is what I wanted. And this is an instance of willing and scared, because I was convinced that if I did that, or on a certain level, I was afraid that if I did that, people wouldn't work with me. They would say, "Oh, well, I can only work at this time on a Saturday," or "Oh, well, I can only meet midday on Thursdays." And that I would kind of need to just be willing to work all the time if I wanted this thing to go. But I also knew that that wouldn't work for me, that I could do it for a time, but that 10 years down the road, 20 years down the road, that would not be a choice that I could sustain. So I didn't go into the decision feeling lighthearted and like it was going to be easy and like it was going to be no problem. But I went into it knowing that one of the things that I wanted out of working for myself, rather than finding a place to go do similar work or adjacent work for a company or an established business, one of the things that I wanted out of working for myself was that particular kind of freedom, the freedom to prioritize my relationships with people, my relationships with the wilderness. And so I knew how important it was for me to not give that away right out the gate. So
Yeah, it sounds
I
like you're
tried it.
really able to like look into the future and know kind of know yourself well enough to know what would work. And I feel like what would be um, relevant here is to understand what career chapter you had before you stepped into coaching. I think that might, my hunch is that might give some clues about why you had even more bravery in structuring your time as you did. Could you
Yeah,
share a little bit about that?
absolutely. So my previous career before I stepped into coaching was as a classroom teacher. Um, and I I loved teaching itself. I loved, and I loved nurturing community within a classroom, and nurturing supportive relationships between students, among the group as a whole. And also, one of the aspects of being a classroom teacher, so distinguishing between teaching and being a classroom teacher, one of the aspects that really was difficult for me was the schedule of tasks outside of the time when I was with my students and how much time I needed to give to those tasks. Some of them that were necessary in order to be prepared in the classroom. And then some that were much more administrative, some to kind of varying degrees of necessity. But I, on school days, was often at school for 13 hours, 12 or 13 hours. And, it was teaching, but then it was also prepping for the next day. It was grading, it was lesson planning, it was meetings, it was all kinds of different things. But it really was not uncommon for me to be on campus for 10 to 13 hours on a school day. And then I'd come home and try to squeeze in a quick workout at the climbing gym and eat dinner and go to bed and get up the next day and be ready to do it again. And I just felt how much that didn't work for me. That rhythm of life just didn't work for me. I could feel my level of stress. I could feel it it came out in difficulty sleeping and all of those kinds of things. So I left that career as a classroom teacher, and I actually left without a plan for what came next. I didn't yet know what I would do next, but I knew that environment wasn't working for me. So I
Off
stepped
into the
away.
wilderness.
Yeah.
Off into
Yeah.
the wilderness you went.
Kind of literally. I stepped away and my partner and I um, moved into our Mazda and went on an extended adventure climbing and mountain biking and a little bit of surfing for the better part of a couple of years, and just explored and played and spent time in the wilderness and together and visiting friends who lived in many of the places we were going to play. And so that was
Yes.
kind of, yeah.
Sorry. I was just like, I'm so glad we're having this because I'm kind of getting to piece back the things that I know, and it seems like that was could have been such a cleanse. I hear about people who feel like they're burnt out, and I think a question that comes up sometimes is like, how much time does it really take to restore oneself? And so to even just know that, it wasn't even just a couple months; it was like the better part of a couple years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And I think, I mean, absolutely worth noting that he and I were both in a position of huge privilege to be able to do that. To have been able to save in a way that allowed us to financially do it and to be able to have the time to do it. And
Yeah, I wanted to go there actually, and a quote I read in a book last weekend comes to mind, which is, "Money is time, and time is everything." And I'm growing up, my dad always said, "Time is money." But I liked hearing the flip of it. Is like money can give you the security to take the time, and all we have is time. Time is everything. Because I think time is a theme that's really coming to the forefront for me as I move through this conversation with you. It's like, to live your values, you talk about the time you need with nature, the time you need to kind of spend with yourself. And so, like, when I think of your life from an outside view, it just really feels like you have an abundance. You're rich in more time than the average 9 to 5er, and you purposely chose that. And I think a lot of people, again, putting myself in a hypothetical shoes of like, well, but how do you do that, right? Like, how do you, without a bunch, being kind of like independently wealthy, how do you take that kind of time? And, without going too into the details, I don't know you to be like hugely independently wealthy or anything like that. So like,
Right.
what does it take?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's such an interesting, I think worth noting too, that the career that I was coming from was teaching, not known for being supremely lucrative.
Right. Yeah. Wasn't investment banking or anything.
Right. Exactly. Um, and so that was kind of an experience of simultaneously feeling so stretched thin when it came to time and feeling a lot of financial tension. So when I was teaching, I was also doing a fair amount of private tutoring to supplement my teaching income. And some of that was kind of with an eye toward this time of adventuring that at the outset we didn't have a plan to spend 2 years on the road playing. um, Initially we were thinking about moving across the country, and we were just going to take a couple of months to get there and climb and mountain bike along the way. And so I was tutoring to supplement my teaching income. We were considering buying a house on the other side of the country, and then we didn't. We got to the place that we were considering. We spent much more time getting there than we originally had thought we would. And then when we got there, it didn't feel like a fit for either of us. So we spent a climbing season in the area and then kind of kept going, kept adventuring. Um, so the lead up to the trip was in some ways kind of its counterpart of working so much in order to save money to then be able to go on a trip like that, and travel and just explore. And I think there's an element too of lifestyle worth mentioning, um, because as we traveled, we weren't staying in hotels or going out to eat at fancy restaurants. We were sleeping in a tent and cooking on a camp stove or over a fire, which for both of us is the first choice, right? It was not, okay, we have to make this sacrifice and not stay in hotels in order to save money. It was, no, we would rather be sleeping on the ground and cooking our meals over a camp stove under the stars. Um, but that lifestyle preference is requires less money than a preference for staying in fancy hotels and eating at fancy restaurants and all of these
Yes.
other types of
Kind
things
of
that can.
convenient that like your natural first choice was
It is.
the money saving thing. And I do hear that you worked really hard and you put in the extra hours. I mean, teachers already work hard, but you were doing additional tutoring sessions. So, um, you know what it's like to put in the hours. What do you think is the difference between someone who has a similar experience to you and thinks, oh my gosh, I'm just like squeezing in a little bit of life and then going back to work and then rinse and repeat, and like I feel the stress, or I'm not sleeping well, I'm not feeling well. Someone who stays in that and endures, and then someone who says, this isn't working for me and makes a change and moves on. Well, how would you describe like the core difference of like what needs to happen to get from the former position to the latter?
I'm trying to reflect back on what it was for me. I imagine it's a little different for everybody. For me, I think I perhaps hit a point at which I was more pulled by what I needed and wanted rather than being pushed by fear. Because although kind of the financial realities of being a public school classroom teacher in California were not without their stresses, there was an element of what felt like stability or security in receiving 2 paychecks every single month, and they were always for the same amount, and they were going to keep coming.
Right.
Or that at least was, we have no guarantees, but that at least was the story I think that I attached to it. And so there was fear around letting that go. And I think I hit a point where the energy and the draw, the excitement, the pull of what I knew I really needed was stronger.
Right. I think I just recently recorded a podcast episode about like, how do you know that you're ready to work for yourself? And I definitely talk about, with best practices of saving up for your emergency fund and your financial runway, that everybody will have a different like risk tolerance level. And yeah, and some people are much more uncomfortable with jumping. But what I'm hearing, yeah, is like it's not that it was easy for you by any means, but there was this tipping point where the call to do something else, was stronger than the fear of staying. As a quick aside, it reminds me, one of the first life coaches that I ever like talked to did something interesting, which was take her clients on kind of like little field trips or physical things that mirrored what they were kind of working on in their life. I remember her talking to me about taking a client rock climbing, actually.
Yeah.
And it strikes me that like your confidence of like literally being out in the wilderness and having your tent and not always maybe having a total roadmap of where to hike next, but just like starting to trust yourself. And like, yes, it's scary. Yes, if there's like a little sound in the bush and you don't know what it is, or yeah, you don't know, what's out there in the forest, but my hunch, and you tell me if I'm wrong, is that you're growing your confidence over time. And it's like you have that dexterity and confidence in a natural setting. I wonder how much of that like builds confidence to the sort of like civilization setting of like, I'm going to be able to make money and I'm going to somehow have a job again. And like, I don't have to have it all figured out, but I really trust sort of what's in my own little personal toolkit. Does that connection make sense?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Um, I I tend to feel much more comfortable and at ease in the wilderness, like in nature wilderness, than I do in civilization.
Does not surprise me.
um, but I think what you touched on right before you asked that question is a salient point here. You were discussing having some runway, having emergency fund, and that threshold is different for everybody. I think that the savings that my partner and I were growing in the lead up to what we thought was going to be a move, I imagine that growing savings account number was part of what allowed the pull of what I needed to be stronger than the fear. Because the fear, I think, to a certain degree, or I imagine, probably diminished as I could see, okay, we have an emergency fund that's solid. We have runway for X number of months of all of our living expenses. We have, and as I could see kind of that context shifting and changing, I imagine that opened up more space for me to hear and listen to what I really needed. Because I think, I don't know, I've listened to a lot of, not a lot of, some kind of popular trendy books on finances and being a business owner or creating a thing. And I think that many of them ignore or seem to ignore some of the realities of living in a society that's structured the way ours is. That in our society, money is a reality that's tricky to ignore, because at the end of the day, it's often what allows for things like food and shelter to also be realities. And I won't say always, because there, of course, are people who are creating different ways to engage with those things. And I don't want to box anything in, but I also just want to make sure that I'm not sharing about the experience in a way that feels like it kind of flippantly ignores what is a reality for many
Mm-hmm.
people.
Yeah, I I think it's always good to underline that, and also I didn't take it as such. I think yeah, you were diligent and were making plans, and I think security minded wise, like maybe you and I are friends for a reason, but I've definitely left from a job without knowing what's next, kind of feeling like I needed to have
Mm-hmm.
some space in order to like let the new clarity come in, and it's not something that everyone is able to do. But it's like, yeah, how can I have enough confidence about being held in the next transitional chapter and trust in myself and the world that something else is going to show up, right? And I guess to try to make some of what we've talked about like mappable or even actionable for someone listening, what initial steps could you brainstorm that would help someone think like, okay, I want to create a values like based, values informed business like Alice? How do I even start doing that?
I think, and this one, it feels like it's right here, but I think the most important place to start is to really know what your values are, and to know them in a way that you feel them, that like it lights up your body when you say that value out loud to yourself. There are a lot of values lists, right? Kind of values inventories that are readily available through a quick online search. But I actually wouldn't recommend starting there, because I think that when we start by choosing our values from a list, it can be really easy to choose the values we think we're supposed to have, often without even intending to do so, but kind of to choose the values that we think sound good or look good, but aren't necessarily true and essential for us. So instead of starting with a list, I recommend starting with yourself, starting with your lived experience. Um, because I think most of us, at least in moments, have already really lived into the values that are the most important to us, whether we were doing it consciously or not. Um, so if we start with ourselves, if we start with the life that we live, the experience that we've had, I think that gives us a way that we can uncover values that are really true for us. And there are lots of exercises that people can do to uncover values. One place to start is to ask yourself, when in my life have I felt the most alive? You can change the wording of that question a little bit to make it fit for you. When in my life have I felt the most like myself? When in my life have I felt the most, plug in whatever the word is for you, and then journal about that question, do art about that question, dance about it, explore your experience in life in different moments when you felt deeply alive, and then start to notice what those moments had in common. Were you laughing with friends in all of those moments? Were you serving others in all of those moments? Were you adventuring? Were you moving really slowly and savoring something? What's the common thread in those experiences that really matters to you? And as it starts to unfold, as it starts to kind of show itself, try on different names. What can you call that thing? What can you call that energy? What can you call that value that sparks something in your body when you say it out loud? Because one of the ways that values can really guide us is we can lean into them kind of like a compass. And if our values are in our bodies instead of just being an intellectual thought in our heads, then we can quickly check in. Okay, how does this align with my value of fill in the blank? So how does this align with my value of wilderness? and my body can tell me, instead of me being kind of stuck up in my head trying to analyze what aspect of it might align with this value versus what might not. My body will just give me feedback. So I would recommend starting there. And if you feel stuck, if you want support around that, reach out to Melissa. Reach out to Melissa and do some values work with Melissa.
Plot twist. Yeah, I was going to say, this is a good segue to say, where can people find you? But yes, I actually was thinking maybe I could link to my free values exercise that I have posted on my site, which kind of, I think, Alice, you put beautiful language to it, but basically will help guide you through what Alice just so lovingly described. But yeah, Alice, as we start to come to a close together, where can people find you? You might want to connect.
Yeah. So the best place to connect is on my email list. And you can sign up for that if you want to at my website. So my website is alicetj.com. And the email list is under the Read and Listen tab.
Amazing. Well, now I just want to go play outside after this conversation and, I don't know, frolic around. That's generally how I feel inspired after I talk with you. Thank you so much for sharing bits of your story today. And it's so nice to know that there's someone as just as empathetic and brave and tuned in as you, who's doing this relational work. And I love the business that you've created for yourself. So yeah, thank you, Alice.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
A topic I want to highlight from the conversation with Alice is about having the boldness, the courage to set your own boundaries about when you're willing to work and when you're ready to be available for not just your clients, but anyone else who wants your attention in the workspace. Alice had to know that she did not want to work 5 days a week ahead of time. Her life outside of something tethered to a phone, which is how she does her coaching calls, was so great that she knew that it just wasn't going to satisfy her to have a business that had her in it 40 hours a week. And she shared in our conversation about the fear that came with, like, oh my gosh, if I say I'm only working these days, these hours, that she wasn't going to get enough clients who could accommodate that. And what she learned by doing is that it did work, and people who did really want to work with her made it work for them. So I think this topic is really relevant for people who are newer in their business journey, because we're so desirous for new business and for new opportunities to practice and grow our confidence and grow our income, right? So we want to just like make ourselves available all the time. But the result of that is that we're available and on all the time. And some of us can kind of do that for a while. But if you're someone who knows that you need a certain amount of rest, of recharge time, maybe you're someone with like a chronic illness and knows that you just can't be on all the time, you're going to hopefully take a page out of Alice's book here and be really courageous from the start to say, these are the hours that I work, and this is when I'm available. And you can even put different systems into place to kind of help reinforce that, right? Maybe you even have an away message that you set on a Friday to say, hey, I'm not in the office on Fridays, but I'll get back to you on Monday, right? So what that takes is a certain kind of faith that you are going to provide enough information and value that someone who was interested in working with you is going to be compelled enough to make it work, to actually do the accommodation on their side in order to figure out how to work within your schedule. And I know that Alice's case, and it's one I can relate to as a fellow coach, it's like we have regular kind of 1 hour, well, half an hour to 1 hour calls.
And I want to recognize that that schedule and the amount of clients that we need and the kind of relationships that we form is different than someone who maybe just needs one or two big clients. And that can feel even more pressure filled because you're like, ooh, if I don't have them, I don't have anything, right? So, how do you stay in tune with the boundaries of what you're willing to give so you don't feel like you are over giving, and it feels like you can kind of set up an agreement with a company as with a contract to say, this is going to set us up for success. I think it always starts with just like knowing yourself and doing your best to kind of take a moment of clarity and just even simply writing a list like, okay, I don't want to be on Slack after 5 p.m. I am not working on weekends. I am not going to bend over backwards if the client moves the due date, right? I'm going to even put that a clause in my contract to say, we are agreeing on these certain deliverable dates, and if you need something expedited, I'll do my best to accommodate, or maybe even I'll do a kind of a rush fee, additional fee to be compensated for that extra push of energy. So take that time, especially if you're someone who knows that whole point of doing your own business and your own thing was to create more of that work-life balance for yourself. What balance do you need, and how do you build that into the structure of your business?